Today we're going to start a new series on the book of Titus. But before we get into the message of Titus, I want to talk with you about threats. Now, I'm not trying to panic you or give you a lot of anxiety, but we face a lot of threats in the modern world. And I was recently listening to an interview with like a cybersecurity guru, and he was talking about the threats that we face, and he was talking about sort of exotic viruses that can get into our computers. And he was talking about our smartphones and how it's not too hard to have someone compromise your smartphone. They can take over your camera, they can look at you at all sorts of weird hours. You can download an app like a flashlight app or a game app that's really innocent. And it comes with all these permissions that you give it to get into your phone and your contacts and your personal info. And pretty easily people can compromise your information. And he was talking about how in the not too distant future, we're all going to drive cars that are easily hackable. I'm not even sure what that really means, but we face a lot of threats out there, and not just tech threats, but we face terrorism, we face the threats of mass shootings. There's a lot of reasons to have anxiety in this life, especially if you have kids or grandkids. And because we have so many threats in our lives, we can sort of appreciate the book of Titus because Titus is a letter written to Christians who are facing threats. They really had two main problems. First of all, they lived in a pagan culture, a culture that didn't care anything about God, and that was a threat to them in their walk with God. But they also faced threats from the inside. They faced false teachers who were within their church and who were messing things up. And they were causing a lot of distress for families and small groups, and we read about that in the letter. For there are many who are insubordinate, empty talkers and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision party. They must be silenced, since they are upsetting whole families by teaching for shameful gain what they ought not to teach. You can see in that verse that the Christians faced some real problems. They really were threatened by not just their culture, but these false teachers who were telling them that it's not just good enough to believe in Jesus and to follow God through Jesus Christ, but you have to bring in all these Jewish rituals and follow those too. And so people were really confused. And that's where this letter comes from. It's written by the Apostle Paul, who helped to start this church. And Paul, in this letter, he tells these young believers, these confused spiritual seekers, in some ways, he tells them to come back to the truth of the gospel, to come back to the message of salvation. That's what the gospel is. We're going to get into that. And he also shows them how this message of salvation is supposed to transform their lives, how if they hold fast to the truth of God's word, it'll change their families and their groups. And he encourages them through developing a structure of support and leadership and mentoring. He shows that if they do this, they're going to be able to withstand the threats that they face. And I think that's really exciting because although we're pretty removed from this church that lived 2,000 years ago, we face threats to our faith. And we need the same things. We need God's truth. We need the message of salvation. And we also need the similar structure of mentoring and groups and families and people who are secure in God's truth so we can help one another grow together in the grace of God. And so if you have felt threatened with your faith or your pursuit of God, or if you just kind of feel threatened by life in general, I think what you're going to find in the book of Titus is that God has got answers to the threats that we face. So let's begin by opening up to Titus chapter 1.